So the Harrison Act, again, this is a piece of tax legislation. So its goal is to require those who produce, import, manufacture, compound, deal in, dispense, or give away these drugs to register and pay taxes. The first two substances that were included were opium and cocaine, and then it was expanded to include other controlled substances, which we'll continue to talk about throughout class. So when we talk about the regulation of pharmaceuticals, now we're talking about prescription drugs, those drugs that are prescribed by physicians and legal to take. One of the important concepts that we'll talk about here is purity. Now again, because you could cook up that elixir or tonic in your backyard and you could put in really anything you wanted, one of the things that we were looking to control was the purity of that substance. So according to the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act, you have to accurately list the contents. So if you're going to put, horse manure or tar in your medication, then it needs to show up on the label. Initially, like a lot of regulatory efforts here in the United States, manufacturers were supposed to cooperate voluntarily. But in 1912, we actually saw an amendment to the Pure Food and Drug Act that made cooperation mandatory. So if you made false or fraudulent claims, then you could be prosecuted under the Shirley Amendment to the Pure Food and Drug Act. So another major social goal at the time was the safety of these medications, but we don't actually see that included in the 1906 Act. Really all we're talking about at that point is the purity. Now in 1938 we start to see an increased role for the FDA. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act now required pre-market testing for toxicity. So if you had pure cocaine in your toothache drops, you were okay under the 1906 law, but then in 1938 you actually had to prove that it was safe to give people that medication as a treatment for a toothache. So this is all we are where we also start to see the labeling with directions that we're accustomed to. It was not always available in the same form that we're used to now, but that was when we started requiring that here in the United States. Different directions for OTC, over-the-counter drugs, and prescription drugs. If the drug is going to be sold over the counter, if it's approved for that, then it needs consumer instructions. And then, of course, if it's a prescription drug, then it is required to be sold only with a prescription from a healthcare professional. All right, so another major category of concern with these laws is the effectiveness. Does the medication actually do what you're saying it does? So we didn't see any concern about that in the 1906 law, and then in 1938 we also did not see changes that applied to effectiveness. We don't actually see laws applying to effectiveness until 1962. So there we see the Kefauver-Harris amendments to the Act, and now we're requiring a couple of different things. First of all, before you can start testing your drug with human subjects, you need to get pre-approval. You need to get approval from the FDA that you can actually start your human testing. And if you're going to be advertising, because we're starting to see that increasing power of advertising, this is the Mad Men era for those of you who are fans, you have to include information about adverse reactions. So we're very familiar with that, but this actually didn't come about until 1962. And if it's a new drug, so not existing drugs, but for new drugs, you actually have to demonstrate that it does what you say it does. You have to demonstrate that it's effective for the illnesses that you mentioned. So this whole idea that we're going to sell drugs that only contain what we say they do, that are safe for human consumption and do what we say they're going to do, is as recent as 1962 here in the United States. So we talked a bit about the FDA and that new drug approval process, and it's important to know this is a very complicated and expensive process. So when we talk about things like orphan diseases that are not very prevalent in our society, or things that might be very expensive, like the development of a new antibiotic or a new vaccine, that we're looking at an expensive and complicated process when we're trying to get one of these approved. So while the drug is being researched, so while it's preclinical, so it's before it's in use, the company that's developing it has to submit an IND, a Notice of Claimed Investigational Exemption for a new drug. So at some point they're going to start giving it to people without FDA approval. So this is the notice that they're interested in starting to investigate this drug. And then they'll move into the clinical trials phase. At the end of it, they'll get full FDA approval, but that IND has to be approved before they can move into the clinical trials that lead to final approval. So a phase 1 trial, this is actually where the medication is tested on healthy volunteers. So these are not people who have the condition that the drug is targeted to. And the question here is how the drug is absorbed and excreted. So it'll be administered to about 20 to 80 people. And we're looking for evidence that the drug does not cause additional health problems in those volunteers, and that it is absorbed and excreted in the way that the researchers expected. So at phase 2, now we start talking about effectiveness. So phase 1 is safety, phase 2 is effectiveness. Purity, we're assuming, based on the 1906 law, is already handled. So phase 2, we're talking about effectiveness. Now we start testing with a few hundred patients who actually have the condition of concern, and those patients are closely monitored for any possible side effects. And also the drug needs to be established that it's more effective than the current approved option. And then finally, in phase 3, we start to see broader effectiveness testing. So we're looking at now thousands of patients, typically 1,000 to 5,000, continuing to ask those questions about additional side effects and whether or not the drug is more effective than the current option. So we have some additional legislation that affects the FDA. We just talked a bit about the Orphan Drug Act. So these are drugs for diseases that are rare. So there's probably not a lot of financial incentive for a drug company to invest all that money in the research and development and then the clinical trial and approval process for a drug that they may only sell a handful of prescriptions for every year. So the Orphan Drug Act offered financial incentives in terms of tax breaks and other incentives to companies that would be willing to take on that type of research, development, and testing. We also had the Prescription Drug Marketing Act of 1988. So before this act was passed, the efforts of drug companies to market their new products to physicians really came into question. So before we leave the FDA, we've got a couple of other important pieces of legislation that affect the FDA and how it operates. The first one applies to those orphan diseases, the ones that we just talked about that only affect a handful of people here in the United States and around the world. So the Orphan Drug Act gives drug companies some financial incentives for developing drugs for those rare disorders. So we've got an expensive R&D process, and then we've got an expensive 3-stage clinical trial process, and it may not make financial sense for a company to pursue a drug that they may only write a few prescriptions for a year. So this act makes it more financially feasible for pharmaceutical companies to pursue medications for those more rare diseases. We've also got the Prescription Drug Marketing Act of 1988. Before this act passed, there was really not a lot of regulation in place on how prescription drugs could be marketed to physicians. Now, we had some restrictions on marketing to consumers, but to physicians, there weren't a lot of rules in place, and there were some abuses that made people wonder whether physicians were prescribing the medications because they were the best choice or because of some of the incentives offered by the pharmaceutical companies. So in 1988, we passed that law, and now the interactions that can take place between physicians and pharmaceutical companies are much more closely managed. And the goal there, of course, is patient safety, making sure that patients receive the drug that's best for them, for health, safety, and financial reasons, as opposed to the drug that's best for the physician based on marketing reasons. And then finally, 1997, the FDA Modernization Act. So this updated the act, which again, this is fairly old. So some new guidelines for adverse effects. What happened when a drug had already been approved, hit the market, and then we started seeing more adverse effects than we'd like to see. And then off-label use. So off-label use is interesting. An off-label use of a drug is one that is not approved by the FDA. So when the drug goes through that approval process with the FDA, the manufacturer, the pharmaceutical company, has to be very clear about what the purpose of the drug is and how effective the drug is in treating that condition. Now, drugs, of course, are complicated substances, and sometimes they have effects that are not anticipated. If we think about maybe Zyban, which was originally marketed as an assist for tobacco cessation, so a way to help people quit smoking. and people found that it also worked as an antidepressant. So if the drug was not approved as an antidepressant, then an off-label use would be using that medication, trade name Zyban, to treat depression. Now, in this case, they went back through the approval process, and they also had the medication, I believe it's bupropion, approved for antidepressant use as well. Okay, so that's an off-label use. And before that 1997 Modernization Act, drug companies were allowed to distribute that off-label use, or at least it wasn't, their behavior wasn't restricted. So after 1997, if it has not gone through the FDA approval process for that specific condition, then the pharmaceutical company can't distribute any information for that use, only the one that it was approved for.